The winter of 1882 came early to Red Rock Canyon in the Arizona Territory, painting the layered sandstone cliffs with frost and dusting the rocky ledges with snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the pale morning light. It was on such a morning that Caleb Thornton and his wife, Sarah, stood at the entrance of a cave carved deep into the canyon wall, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as they contemplated a decision that would change their lives forever. Caleb adjusted his wide-brim hat and pulled his heavy winter coat tighter against the biting wind. Beside him, Sarah wrapped her thick wool shawl more snugly around her shoulders, her bonnet tied firmly beneath her chin. They had been staring at that dark opening in the rock face for nearly an hour, watching as the morning sun crept across the canyon floor, but failed to penetrate the mysterious depths of the cave. "What do you think, Sarah?" Caleb finally asked, his weathered hand finding hers beneath the layers of wool and leather. Sarah Thornton had never been one to shy away from unconventional ideas. Back in St. Louis, she had scandalized her family by marrying a cowboy with nothing but a horse, a dream, and honest hands willing to work. She had left behind silk dresses and tea parties for calico and campfires, and she had never once regretted it. "I think," she said slowly, her eyes tracing the natural overhang that protected the cave entrance from the elements, "that it's the most sensible thing we've considered in months." They had come west with high hopes and modest savings, planning to stake a claim and build a ranch like so many others flooding into the territory. But the good land was gone, already claimed by those who had arrived years before. What remained was either too expensive, too remote, or too hostile for cattle. They had spent 3 months sleeping in a drafty tent, watching their savings dwindle while winter approached with the inevitability of a creditor's knock. The cave had been Caleb's discovery. While tracking a stray calf through the canyon, he had taken shelter from a sudden snowstorm and found himself standing in a natural cathedral of stone. The entrance was wide and tall, easily 15 feet high and 20 feet across. But more importantly, the cave extended back into the mountain, creating a series of chambers that stayed remarkably dry and maintained a steady temperature even as the wind howled outside. "People will think we've lost our minds," Caleb warned, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself more than his wife. "People already think we've lost our minds," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "We left civilization to chase cattle through the desert. A cave can't make us look much crazier than we already are." And so, with winter breathing down their necks and their options exhausted, Caleb and Sarah Thornton decided to build their home inside the cave at Red Rock Canyon. The first order of business was exploration. Caleb fashioned torches from dried brush and tallow, and together they mapped the cave's interior with careful precision. The main chamber was vast, with a ceiling that arched 20 feet overhead at its highest point. Natural ventilation came from small fissures in the rock that drew smoke upward and outward, creating a natural chimney effect. Beyond the main chamber, 2 smaller rooms branched off, each about the size of a generous bedroom. The floor was mostly level, worn smooth by thousands of years of water flow that had long since found another course. "It's like someone built it just for us," Sarah marveled, her voice echoing softly off the stone walls. They set to work immediately. Caleb built a stone wall at the cave entrance, leaving space for a heavy wooden door and 2 windows. The wall served multiple purposes. It kept out the worst of the winter wind, provided security, and gave their cave home the appearance of a proper dwelling from the outside. He used rocks from the canyon floor, cementing them together with mud and clay that Sarah mixed according to a recipe she'd learned from a Mexican woman in the last town they'd passed through. The construction was back-breaking work. Each stone had to be carefully selected for size and shape, then hauled from the canyon floor to the cave entrance. Caleb's hands became raw and calloused, but he persisted, building the wall one stone at a time, ensuring each layer was level and secure. The door frame he constructed from lumber salvaged from an abandoned homestead. Glass was expensive and fragile, so Caleb fashioned wooden shutters that could be opened during the day for light and air, then closed and barred at night for security and warmth. Sarah sewed canvas curtains to hang behind the shutters, providing extra insulation against the cold. While Caleb worked on the exterior, Sarah focused on making the interior livable and comfortable. She swept the cave floor clean and covered it with canvas and rugs they had brought in their wagon. The process took days. First, she had to remove all the loose rocks and debris that had accumulated over centuries. Then she scrubbed the stone floor with water hauled from the creek, using a brush made from stiff grass bundles. Only when the floor was completely clean did she lay down the canvas, stretching it tight and securing the edges with rocks. She created a kitchen area in one corner of the main chamber, using flat rocks to build a proper hearth and cooking surface. This required experimentation. The first arrangement didn't draw smoke properly, filling the cave with choking fumes. It was only on the third try, after Caleb helped her adjust the angle of the stones, that the natural chimney effect worked perfectly, drawing smoke up through the fissures in the ceiling. Sarah also built a pantry using wooden crates and shelves Caleb constructed. She organized their supplies with precision: flour and cornmeal on the top shelf, canned goods in the middle, tools on the bottom. In a home carved from stone, organization was essential. The smaller chambers became their bedroom and a storage room. Sarah hung blankets to create doorways, providing privacy and additional insulation. She arranged their few pieces of furniture: a bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, and a trunk, with the care of someone decorating a mansion rather than a cave. It took them 3 weeks of hard work, but by the time they were finished, the cave had been transformed into a surprisingly comfortable home. The thick stone walls kept the interior at a steady temperature, warm enough that they rarely needed more than a small fire in the hearth. The windows in the front wall let in light during the day, and at night, oil lamps cast a golden glow that reflected off the smooth rock walls, creating an almost cozy atmosphere. That's when the trouble started. The nearest town was Sweetwater, a collection of rough buildings and rougher people about 8 miles south of Red Rock Canyon. Caleb and Sarah made their first trip there after completing their cave home, needing supplies and hoping to find work. The moment they mentioned where they lived, the reaction was immediate and mocking. "You built a what?" The storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson, laughed so hard his belly shook. "A house in a cave? Like some kind of animals?" The story spread through Sweetwater faster than a prairie fire. By the time Caleb and Sarah finished their shopping, half the town had heard about the crazy couple living in a hole in the ground. People pointed and whispered. Children giggled. Even the town drunk sitting on the steps of the saloon shook his head in disapproval. "Folks are meant to live in proper houses," declared Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the self-appointed arbiter of social propriety in Sweetwater. She stood in front of the general store, her considerable frame blocking the doorway as she lectured anyone who would listen. "Wood and nails. That's what the good Lord intended. Living in a cave it's primitive. It's shameful." Sarah held her head high as they loaded their supplies into the wagon, but Caleb could see the hurt in her eyes. She had endured hardship without complaint, but public humiliation cut deeper than any physical discomfort. "Pay them no mind," Caleb said quietly as they drove out of town. "We've got a roof over our heads and walls around us. That's more than some can say." But the mockery didn't stop with words. Over the following weeks, their cave home became a source of entertainment for the good people of Sweetwater. Riders would occasionally detour to Red Rock Canyon just to gawk at the cave dwellers. Some were content to point and laugh from a distance. Others shouted insults or made animal noises. One particularly humiliating incident occurred when a group of young men from town rode out on a Saturday, clearly having consumed significant whiskey. They stood outside howling like wolves and making crude jokes. When Caleb stepped outside to confront them, they scattered like startled quail, laughing as they rode away. Sarah had heard every word, and Caleb saw tears in her eyes that evening. The town's children picked up the habit from their parents. When Sarah was shopping in Sweetwater, youngsters followed her down the street, chanting, "Cave woman, cave woman." Their mothers watched and did nothing to stop them. Sarah held her head high and completed her errands, but her hands shook as she loaded purchases into the wagon. The worst offender was Jack Maddox, a wealthy rancher who owned most of the good grazing land around Sweetwater. He had been one of the early settlers, and his success had made him arrogant. On several occasions, he rode out to the canyon with his ranch hands, making a show of their visit. "Thornton," he'd shout from outside the cave entrance, "you and your wife come out so we can see if you've grown fur yet." His men would laugh, and Maddox would continue his performance, always just careful enough to avoid outright threats, but making his contempt abundantly clear. He seemed particularly offended that Caleb had refused to work for him as a ranch hand, choosing instead to maintain his independence despite having to live in a cave. Yet through all of this, Caleb and Sarah maintained their dignity. When confronted with mockery, they responded with quiet courtesy. When insulted, they offered no response at all. They went about their business with heads held high, refusing to give their tormentors the satisfaction of seeing them broken. Through it all, Caleb and Sarah persevered. They ignored the taunts and focused on building their life. Caleb found work as a tracker and occasional cowhand for some of the smaller ranchers who cared more about skill than pride. Sarah took in mending and sold preserves she made from wild berries and fruit from the scattered trees in the canyon. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. Winter deepened, and with it came a beauty that few in Sweetwater took time to appreciate. The canyon walls, already spectacular in summer, became a wonderland of ice and snow. Icicles hung from the ledges like crystal chandeliers, and the rock faces sparkled with frost. Inside their cave, Caleb and Sarah were warm and comfortable, their home maintaining its steady temperature while wooden structures in Sweetwater creaked and groaned under the weight of snow and ice. It was in late January, during the coldest week anyone could remember, that everything changed. The storm began with little warning. One moment the sky was clear and blue. The next, it was choked with dark clouds that rolled in from the north like a massive gray blanket. The temperature plummeted, and snow began to fall with an intensity that was frightening in its ferocity. Caleb was in Sweetwater when the storm hit, having ridden in that morning to deliver some tracking work he'd completed for a rancher. Sarah was home alone, and as the wind began to howl through the canyon, he knew he had to get back to her immediately. "You'll never make it," Henderson warned from inside his store, where Caleb had stopped to warm himself. "That's a killer storm, Thornton. You'd best stay here until it passes." But Caleb thought of Sarah alone in the cave and shook his head. "I'll make it." He almost didn't. The 8 miles back to Red Rock Canyon became an odyssey through a white hell. The wind drove snow into his eyes and mouth, and visibility dropped to mere feet. His horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, struggled through drifts that grew deeper with every passing minute. Twice they nearly went over the edge of a ravine, saved only by Belle's instincts and Caleb's desperate prayers. When he finally reached the cave, he was half frozen, and Belle was trembling with exhaustion. Sarah threw open the door, pulling both man and horse inside. Yes, Belle came inside. They had built the entrance large enough to accommodate the horse in an emergency, and this certainly qualified. It was one of Caleb's wisest decisions, though he hadn't known it at the time. "Thank God," Sarah breathed, helping Caleb peel off his frozen coat. "I was so worried." Once Caleb had thawed by the fire and they'd settled Belle in a corner with feed and water, they secured the heavy wooden door and prepared to wait out the storm. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing and snow piled against the entrance wall. But inside the cave, they were safe and warm. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th morning, when the wind finally died and an eerie silence fell over the canyon, Caleb opened the door to a transformed world. Snow had piled 6 feet deep in some places, and the temperature was so cold that merely breathing hurt. The main road to Sweetwater had vanished beneath a white blanket. It was Sarah who heard the shouting first. "Help! Someone help us!" The voice was distant but desperate, carried on the frozen air from somewhere to the south. Caleb grabbed his rifle and coat, waded through the snow, and climbed to a higher ledge where he could see farther. What he saw made his blood run cold. A wagon train, 6 wagons in all, had been caught on the open road between Sweetwater and the next town north. They had tried to make it through the storm and failed catastrophically. Wagons were overturned or abandoned, and from this distance, Caleb could see people huddled in small groups, clearly in desperate condition. "We have to help them," Sarah said when he returned and told her what he'd seen. There was no question in her voice, no debate. It was simply a statement of fact. Together, they formulated a plan. The cave was the only shelter within miles that could accommodate a large group. Caleb would ride out and guide the survivors back, while Sarah prepared the cave to receive them. It took 3 trips through the brutal cold. On the first trip, Caleb found 14 people, 2 families with children, several single men, and 2 women traveling alone. All were suffering from exposure, and 2 of the children were in critical condition. He led them back to the cave, Belle breaking trail through the deep snow. Among the first group were the Morrison family, Thomas, Elizabeth, and their 3 children, ages 4 through 9. The youngest, a girl named Emma, was unconscious, her lips blue with cold. Elizabeth Morrison was herself barely conscious, having given her coat to her children hours before. Thomas carried Emma while trying to help his other 2 children walk, but all were near collapse. There was also Samuel Chen, a merchant from San Francisco whose wagon had broken an axle in the storm. He had tried to continue on foot, a decision that nearly cost him his life. By the time Caleb found him, Samuel's feet were severely frostbitten and he could barely stand. The 2 single women were Mary Douglas, the school teacher, and Rose Patterson, a widow heading to Sweetwater to live with her sister. Rose had twisted her ankle badly when her wagon overturned, and Mary had stayed with her rather than trying to make it alone. Their courage and loyalty to each other had kept them both alive, though just barely. When they staggered through the cave entrance, half frozen and barely able to stand, they couldn't believe what they saw. Instead of a crude shelter, they found a warm, dry home with a fire burning cheerfully in the hearth. Sarah had hot soup ready and blankets laid out. The cave's natural insulation kept the interior comfortable, even as the temperature outside remained well below 0. "Good Lord," gasped Thomas Morrison as he collapsed by the fire, still clutching Emma. "It's like a palace." Sarah immediately took Emma from his arms, stripping off the child's frozen clothes and wrapping her in warmed blankets. She had heated stones by the fire, which she now wrapped in cloth and placed around Emma's body. Elizabeth Morrison watched with tears streaming down her face as Sarah worked to save her daughter's life. For the next 6 hours, Sarah monitored Emma's temperature, forcing small sips of warm broth between the child's lips, never leaving her side. Meanwhile, Caleb was already preparing for his second trip. He loaded Belle with additional blankets and what medical supplies they had. Sarah insisted he take most of their food stores. "They need it more than we do," she said firmly, and Caleb knew better than to argue with that tone. On his second and third trips, Caleb brought in the remaining survivors and managed to salvage some supplies from the wrecked wagons. He found the Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who spoke limited English, but whose gratitude needed no translation. There was James Henderson, nephew of the storekeeper, who had been traveling with mining equipment. There were 3 cowboys who had been driving a herd to market when the storm hit. Their cattle were lost, but they had survived. In total, 23 people crowded into the cave at Red Rock Canyon. It should have been cramped and miserable. Instead, it was survival. Sarah worked tirelessly, tending to the sick and injured, organizing the chaos into something manageable. She set up sleeping areas in every available space, hung more blankets for privacy, and somehow managed to keep everyone fed with their limited supplies, supplemented by what had been saved from the wagons. The natural chambers of the cave allowed for some separation. Families in one area, single men in another, the sick in the warmest spots near the hearth. She treated Samuel Chen's frostbitten feet with a poultice she made from herbs and honey, a remedy taught to her by a Navajo woman she'd met months before. She checked on him hourly, changing the bandages and monitoring for signs of infection. She splinted Rose Patterson's ankle and taught Mary Douglas how to help her keep weight off it. She coordinated the cooking, organized water distribution from melted snow, and even led the group in evening prayers for those who wanted them. Caleb, exhausted from his rescue missions, nonetheless continued working. He reinforced the entrance to handle the weight of so many people going in and out. He organized the men to create a latrine system in one of the smaller side chambers, far from the living areas. He rationed the firewood carefully and organized teams to venture out and gather more from the protected overhangs in the canyon when the wind died down briefly. The rescued travelers were astonished by the cave's features. The natural ventilation kept the air fresh despite the crowd. The steady temperature meant no one froze or overheated. The thick walls blocked the howling wind that continued outside. What the people of Sweetwater had mocked as primitive, these survivors recognized as ingenious. "How did you know?" asked one of the women, a schoolteacher named Mary Douglas who had been traveling to a new posting out west. "How did you know to build here?" Sarah smiled as she stirred a pot of stew. "We didn't know. We just needed a home and found this place. The rest was just lucky, I suppose." On the 5th day, riders from Sweetwater finally made it through the snow to check on the wagon train. What they found at Red Rock Canyon shocked them into silence. The people they had mocked and ridiculed had saved 23 lives. The cave they had laughed at had proven to be the difference between life and death. Jack Maddox was among the riders. His own ranch house, solid and expensive as it was, had barely survived the storm. 2 of his outbuildings had collapsed under the weight of snow, and he'd lost several head of cattle. Yet here was the primitive cave home, standing strong and sheltering nearly 24 people in comfort. He stood in the cave entrance, hat in his hands, looking at the organized refugee Sarah had created. Then he looked at Caleb, and something in his expression had changed. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was wrong about a lot of things." News of what happened spread faster than the original mockery had. By the time the survivors had recovered enough to continue their journey a week later, people were coming from all around to see the famous cave home at Red Rock Canyon. This time, they came not to mock, but to marvel. Henderson from the general store rode out personally to apologize. "I spoke poorly of you and your wife," he said to Caleb. "I judged without understanding. I'm sorry." Mrs. Fletcher, the town's social arbiter, brought a basket of food and an invitation for Sarah to join the Sweetwater Ladies Social Club, an honor she had previously deemed impossible for someone who lived in a cave. Sarah politely declined the club, but accepted the food with grace. The schoolteacher, Mary Douglas, stayed an extra week, fascinated by the cave's design. She took notes and made sketches, planning to write about it for an educational journal back east. "People think the frontier is all about conquest," she said to Sarah, "but you've shown it's also about adaptation. You worked with the land instead of against it." The two families with children who had been rescued became fast friends with Caleb and Sarah. They settled in the area, and their children would often visit the cave, treating it like the wonder it was. The cave became a regular stopping point for travelers, and Caleb and Sarah's hospitality became legendary. Perhaps the most significant change came from Jack Maddox, the wealthy rancher, humbled by the storm and the Thorntons' response to it, became an unexpected ally. He offered Caleb a partnership rather than mere employment, managing some of his more remote holdings with the promise of eventually acquiring his own herd. It was the opportunity Caleb had been seeking, a chance to build their future without sacrificing their independence. Spring came to Red Rock Canyon, melting the snow and revealing the land beneath. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible places, splashes of color against the red rock. The cave home remained, now famous throughout the territory, as the place where courage and compassion had turned mockery into respect. One evening, as the sun set and painted the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold, Caleb and Sarah sat at the cave entrance, watching the light show nature provided. Their home was quiet now, just the two of them again, but the echoes of those desperate days remained, a reminder of why they had been put in this place. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked, taking Sarah's hand. "Leaving St. Louis, coming west, living in a cave?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she smiled, that same smile that had first captured his heart years ago. "Regret?" she said softly. "Caleb, we built a home when we had nothing. We stood firm when others mocked us. We saved lives when it mattered most. How could I possibly regret any of that?" She gestured to the canyon around them, to the cave behind them, to the vast sky above. "This isn't what I imagined when we headed west. It's better, because it's real, and it's ours, and it turned out to matter in ways we never could have predicted." Caleb pulled her close, and they sat together as darkness fell and stars began to appear, countless points of light in the endless western sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did on the frontier. But they had learned that strength came not from conforming to others' expectations, but from trusting your own judgment and staying true to your principles. The cave at Red Rock Canyon stood as testament to that truth. What had been dismissed as foolish had proven to be wise. What had been mocked as primitive had shown itself to be ingenious. And what had begun as an act of desperate necessity had become an act of profound hospitality. Years later, when people asked Sarah about those early days, She would smile and say, "Everyone made fun of us until they needed us. Then suddenly, our cave wasn't so primitive anymore. Funny how that works." But she would say it without bitterness, because Sarah Thornton had never been one to hold grudges. She and Caleb had simply done what needed to be done, and the respect they eventually earned was less important than the lives they had saved and the home they had built. The cave remained their home for 5 more years, until Caleb's partnership with Maddox flourished enough that they could afford to build a proper ranch house on land they purchased. But they never sold the cave. Instead, they maintained it as a way station for travelers, a refuge for those caught in storms, and a reminder that wisdom often lies in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Caleb and Sarah would ride back to Red Rock Canyon and sit at the entrance of their old home, remembering the winter they saved 23 lives and earned a community's respect. The cave would welcome them like an old friend, its steady temperature and solid walls unchanged by time. "Home," Sarah would whisper, running her hand along the smooth stone. And Caleb would nod, understanding that home was never really about 4 walls and a roof. It was about the choices you made, the people you helped, and the courage to stand firm in the face of mockery and doubt. The cave at Red Rock Canyon taught them that, and it was a lesson they carried with them for the rest of their days.